The air in courtroom 3B was a monument to stale authority. It smelled of old paper, cheap bleach, and the faint metallic tang of human anxiety, a scent that had seeped into the polished wood of the pews and the scuffed linoleum beneath them over decades of quiet desperation. Sunlight struggled through the tall, grimy windows, illuminating motes of dust that danced like frantic spirits in the oppressive silence. The room was a vacuum, designed to suck the hope out of a man before he even stated his name. At its head, presiding over this kingdom of minor miseries, sat Judge Harrison Thompson. He was not merely a man on a bench, he was an entity that had fused with the elevated platform, the dark wood of the judiciary's throne, having become an extension of his own ego. His black robes were not fabric but a carapace, hiding a soft man who had grown hard with unearned power. His face was a fleshy mask of perpetual dissatisfaction, his jowls quivering with impatience as he dispensed justice like a bored king tossing scraps to dogs. Across the chasm of the courtroom, in the first row of uncomfortable pews, sat Elias Thorne. He was the antithesis of the room's manufactured grandeur. He was a study in quietude, a man who seemed to absorb sound rather than create it. His clothes were simple, civilian, and impeccably clean, but worn at the cuffs and collar in a way that spoke of long, careful use. A plain gray shirt, dark trousers. He could have been a librarian, a watchmaker, a ghost. His hands, resting on his knees, were the only things that betrayed a life of intense precision. They were calloused and strong, the fingers long and steady, but they rested with a stillness that was almost unnerving. In his lap, held with a reverence that seemed entirely out of place in this theater of mundane transgressions, was a small, intricate metal box. It was a cube of interlocking brass and steel gears, plates, and wires, all visible beneath a crystal-clear casing. It was a thing of impossible complexity, a horologist's fever dream. Beside him, her small hand clutching the fabric of his trousers, was his daughter, Lily. Her eyes, wide and dark, darted from the towering judge to her father's calm face, trying to reconcile the terror of the room with the serenity of the man she trusted above all others. The charge against Elias Thorne was as flimsy as a spider's web, yet it had been spun with the malicious strength of the law. It was a public disturbance citation. He had been performing his weekly pro bono maintenance on the old City Hall clock tower, a task he had undertaken for years after the city declared it had no budget for the historic timepiece. A new, overzealous security guard, puffed up with his own minor authority, had seen Elias's specialized tools and the complex diagnostic device he had brought with him. The guard saw not a craftsman, but a threat. He saw not precision instruments, but the components of something sinister. Words had been exchanged. The guard had shouted. Elias had spoken in calm, measured tones, explaining his purpose. The guard, infuriated by a placidity he mistook for insolence, had called the police. The responding officers, caught between a hysterical guard and a silent, unmoving man, had written the ticket just to close the incident. It should have been dismissed with a $500 fine and a stern warning, but the case had landed on the desk of Judge Thompson, and Judge Thompson was having a very bad day. Case number 734-B, The City versus Elias Thorne, a bailiff droned, his voice devoid of any inflection. The words echoed unnaturally in the cavernous room. Elias rose smoothly, his daughter's hand slipping from his leg. He moved with an economy of motion, a quiet grace that was at odds with the stiff, anxious shuffling of those who had come before him. He approached the defendant's table, placing the intricate box carefully on the polished surface before him. He did not look at the judge. He looked at a point on the wall just beyond him, his expression unreadable, his posture erect but not defiant. He was a stone wall, waiting for the inevitable tide. Judge Thompson leaned forward, his bulk straining the fabric of his robes. His eyes, small and piggy, narrowed on the man before him. He scanned the file with a performative flick of his wrist, his lips curling into a sneer. Elias Thorne, public disturbance, resisting the lawful inquiries of a security officer. It says here you were found with suspicious electronic equipment in a public building. He looked up from the paper, his gaze finally falling on the brass and steel cube on the table. His eyes lit up with a kind of predatory curiosity. "Is that the item in question?" he asked, his voice dripping with condescension. Elias's gaze lowered from the wall and met the judge's. His own eyes were a pale, clear blue, like a winter sky. They held no fear, no anger, no pleading. They simply were. "It is, Your Honor," he said. His voice was quiet, but it carried a strange resonance, a low timbre that seemed to vibrate in the silent room. "And what, pray tell, is this contraption?" the judge scoffed, gesturing vaguely with a thick-fingered hand. "Some kind of toy you've built?" The gallery, sparsely populated with other defendants and a few bored onlookers, shifted. A nervous titter of laughter rippled through the pews, quickly suppressed. "It is a diagnostic and calibration tool, Your Honor," Elias replied, his voice still perfectly even, "for horological mechanisms, clocks." "A clock-fixing toy," the judge declared, a cruel smile playing on his lips. He enjoyed this. He enjoyed reducing people to their component parts, to their failures, to their absurd little hobbies. He was a breaker of spirits, and he considered it a public service. "Well, Mr. Thorne, in my courtroom we do not allow toys or unauthorized electronic equipment." He pointed a sausage-like finger at the box. "That object is to be confiscated as evidence. Bailiff, take the trinket." The word hung in the air, heavy and sharp. Trinket. It was a word designed to diminish, to insult, to strip the object of any and all significance. A large, heavy-set bailiff started to move from his position near the wall. He approached the table with the lumbering gait of a man who was used to following orders without question. But Elias did not move. He did not flinch. He simply placed his hand flat on top of the intricate cube, covering the delicate gears. It was not a violent gesture, but it was an absolute one, a final one. The room went silent. Not the oppressive, waiting silence from before, but a new kind, sharp and electric with tension. The hum of the overhead light suddenly seemed as loud as a generator. The bailiff stopped, confused. He looked from the still hand to the judge's reddening face. "Sir," Elias said, his voice dropping even lower, yet losing none of its carrying power, "with all due respect, you cannot take this." Judge Thompson's face, which had been a blotchy pink, began to transition to a deep arterial crimson. His jowls trembled. The sheer audacity of the man, the quiet, calm, infuriating defiance. It was a challenge to the very foundation of his authority, to the sanctity of his courtroom. "What did you just say to me?" he hissed, his voice cracking like a whip. "I said you cannot take this, Your Honor," Elias repeated. He did not raise his voice. He did not add any inflection. He stated it as one might state the law of gravity. It was a fact, immutable and unchangeable. The world could rage against it, but the fact would remain. "Cannot?" The judge's voice rose to a near shriek. The word echoed off the high ceilings. "Cannot? In this room, in this building, on this planet, there is no such thing as cannot when I give an order. Who in God's name do you think you are?" He slammed his gavel down on its block. The sound was like a gunshot in the still air. It made Lily jump, a small, choked sob escaping her lips. Elias's eyes flickered to his daughter for a fraction of a second, and for the first time a flicker of something hard and cold entered his gaze as he turned back to the judge. "You are in contempt of court, you insolent little man," the judge roared, rising slightly from his chair, his knuckles white where he gripped the edge of his bench. "I asked you a question. Who are you to tell me, a superior court judge, what I can and cannot do?" He leaned over the bench, his face contorted in a mask of pure fury. "Are you a lawyer, a scholar, A man of any importance whatsoever? No, you are a tinkerer, a nobody. A scrap merchant with a shiny toy who thinks he is above the law. The public humiliation was a physical force, a wave of scorn that washed over Elias. He could feel the stares of the people in the gallery, a mixture of pity, fear, and morbid curiosity. He could feel the smug satisfaction radiating from the judge. He felt the tremor in the floor as the second, more aggressive bailiff began to move forward, eager to enforce the judge's will. But Elias Thorne did not shrink. He did not wither. He stood, as he had before, a column of granite in a hurricane. His hand remained on the box. "Bailiffs," the judge bellowed, his voice raw with rage, "I gave you an order. Seize the contraband and take this man into custody. I will have him held on a $1 million bond for contempt." The word contraband joined trinket in the poisoned air of the courtroom. The two words defined the box, and by extension, the man. They stripped him of his dignity, his purpose, and his freedom. The heavy-set bailiff lunged forward, reaching for the box. But the second bailiff, a younger man named Miller, was more hesitant. He was a corporal in the Army Reserve, and he had seen men like Elias Thorne before, though never in a place like this. He had seen them in the searing heat of Kandahar and the frozen mountains of the Hindu Kush. He recognized the stillness. It was not the stillness of passivity. It was the stillness of a predator, of a man whose mind was working at 1,000 calculations per second, a man who had absolute control over every muscle, every breath, every heartbeat. Miller noticed the details that the judge, in his blind rage, had missed. He saw the faint white scar that traced Elias's left temple, a whisper of a near miss. He saw the wear pattern on the man's simple leather watch band, a specific type of wear that came from being cinched over the thick cuff of a tactical glove for years on end. He saw the almost imperceptible way Elias's fingers rested on the box, not just covering it, but distributing pressure evenly across its surface, as if he were feeling for a vibration, for a change in temperature. It was a touch born of infinite practice and lethal consequence, and most of all, he saw the man's eyes. They were not the eyes of a madman or a fool. They were the eyes of a man who had looked into the face of oblivion and had not blinked. The first bailiff's hand was inches from the box. Elias didn't move. He simply said with a quiet finality that chilled Miller to the bone, "I would not do that if I were you." The threat was unspoken but absolute. The bailiff, more automaton than man, ignored him. His fingers brushed the cool metal of Elias's own. In that instant, Elias moved. It was not fast, it was not violent, it was impossibly precise. He shifted his weight, rotating his body slightly, using the bailiff's own momentum to guide him past the table. The heavy-set man stumbled, catching himself on the witness stand, his face a mask of confusion. He had not been pushed. He had been redirected, as if he were a stream of water and Elias a smooth stone. Judge Thompson exploded. "Assault! Assault on an officer of the court! That's it! 10 years! You will rot in a cell, you pathetic worm!" He was practically bouncing with apoplectic glee. He had him now. The man had crossed a line. There were witnesses. It was perfect. "Cuff him! Cuff him now!" Miller and the other bailiff now moved in, their duty clear. The first bailiff, embarrassed and angry, grabbed Elias's arm roughly. Miller took the other. Elias did not resist. The fight, if there ever was one, was over. He had protected the box. Now came the consequences. As Miller brought the cold steel of the handcuffs to Elias's right wrist, Elias leaned in, his mouth close to the young bailiff's ear. He didn't whisper. He spoke in that same low, resonant tone, a private command in a public space. "Protocol 734, he said, the words a string of meaningless syllables to anyone else. "Look at the base of the device. There is a serial number. Call that number. Tell them. The watchmaker has a broken timepiece." Miller's blood ran cold. Protocol. It was a word from his world, the world of the military. A word that meant rules of engagement, emergency procedures, life and death. The watchmaker. It sounded like a code name. He felt the metallic click as the cuffs locked around Elias's wrists. The other bailiff was already pushing Elias toward the door, leading to the holding cells, sneering at him. Miller's eyes darted to the table. The box sat there, suddenly looking less like a toy and more like a sleeping dragon. He moved to the table, his heart hammering against his ribs. He tilted the box just enough to see the base. Burned into the metal with a laser's precision was a long string of numbers and letters, and below it, a single 10-digit phone number with a Washington, D.C. area code. He had a choice. A terrible, career-ending, or life-altering choice. He could obey the judge, log the trinket into evidence, and let this strange, quiet man disappear into the maw of the justice system. Or he could obey the man in handcuffs. He could make a phone call that he had no right to make, based on a cryptic message that could be the ravings of a lunatic. He looked at Elias being shoved through the doorway. He saw the man's back, straight and unbowed. He saw the quiet dignity that had not cracked, even in the face of utter humiliation. He saw a brother in arms, a man who had stood his ground for a reason Miller could not comprehend, but one he instinctively knew was profound. He made his choice. While the other bailiff processed the paperwork for Elias Thorne's $1 million bail and contempt charges, Miller slipped out of the courtroom and down a sterile, echoing hallway. He found an empty office, the air thick with the smell of stale coffee. His hand trembled as he pulled out his personal cell phone. He was breaking a dozen regulations, using a personal device for court business, making an unauthorized call, interfering in a case. But the words, Protocol 734, were branded into his mind. He punched in the numbers. The phone did not ring. There was a single electronic click, and then dead silence. For a moment, Miller thought the number was disconnected. He was about to hang up when a voice spoke. It was not a human voice. It was a synthesized, genderless tone, cold and perfect. State authorization code. Miller's throat was dry. I don't have one, he stammered. I was told to call. Protocol 734. The line was silent for 3 full seconds. Miller could hear his own blood roaring in his ears. He had made a mistake, a terrible mistake. Then a new voice came on the line. This one was human. It was a woman, her voice crisp, professional, and utterly devoid of warmth. It was the voice of someone who had not had a moment of doubt in her entire life. Who gave you this number? A man, Miller said, his voice barely a whisper. His name is Elias Thorne. He's been arrested, here, at the county courthouse. The judge tried to confiscate his property. Describe the property, the voice commanded. It's a box, a metal cube with gears and wires. He said to tell you the watchmaker has a broken timepiece. Another silence, this one shorter, but somehow heavier. Miller could hear the faint, almost subliminal sound of keyboards clicking furiously in the background. Hold the line, the woman said. The line didn't go to hold music. It just went back to that unnerving, perfect silence. Miller stood frozen, the phone slick with sweat in his hand. He was no longer just a court bailiff. He had crossed a threshold into a world he didn't understand, a world of protocols and code names. Meanwhile, Elias sat on a cold, concrete bench in a holding cell. The door was thick steel, the only light coming from a small, barred window high on the wall. The air smelled of disinfectant and despair. The cold of the concrete seeped through his thin shirt, but he barely noticed it. He closed his eyes. The scent, the cold, the confinement. It was a trigger. He was no longer in a county courthouse holding cell. He was back in the dust. Timestamp 002500. He felt the suffocating weight of the bomb suit, 100 pounds of Kevlar and ceramic plates that felt like a coffin. He could hear his own breathing, ragged and loud in his helmet, a sound amplified by the comm system. The sun was a merciless hammer in the Iraqi sky, beating down on the sand, turning the air into a shimmering haze. Before him, half buried in the dirt, was the device. It was not a pipe bomb or a crude pressure plate IED. It was a work of art. A multi-stage daisy-chained monstrosity with a sophisticated anti-tamper mechanism, likely designed by a foreign-trained engineer. It was a thing of pure, malevolent genius. His team had called it the Spider's Nest. 3 of their best technicians had already been sent home in bags trying to defuse similar devices. He remembered the feel of the wire cutters in his gloved hands, the delicate snip of a tripwire, the sweat beading on his forehead and tracing cold paths down his temples. He remembered the internal monologue, the calm, detached voice that walked him through the steps, the same voice that had spoken to Judge Thompson. Identify the power source, trace the detonator circuit, look for the secondary, always look for the secondary. He had spent 6 hours in that suit under that sun, his world reduced to a tangled knot of wires and explosives that could vaporize him in a nanosecond. He remembered finding the core, a complex barometric trigger designed to detonate if the device was moved, or if the air pressure changed suddenly. It was a masterpiece of death. And he had disarmed it. He had unmade it, piece by piece, with the patience of a saint and the steady hands of a surgeon. When he was done, the core of the device, a beautiful, terrible piece of engineering, lay inert in his palm. His commander had wanted to destroy it, but Elias had insisted on keeping it, not as a trophy, but as a teaching tool, a reminder. He had spent the next year in his workshop back home, painstakingly deconstructing the trigger, removing every gram of explosive material and rebuilding it into something new. He had incorporated parts from a dozen other devices he had neutralized, each one a memory, each one a life saved. He had turned a weapon of mass destruction into the ultimate puzzle box, the Thorn Labyrinth. It contained no power source, no explosive. But its mechanical complexity was a perfect simulation of the most difficult disarmaments he had ever faced. It was how he kept his skills from rusting. It was how he taught the new generation of EOD technicians, the young men and women who would walk the same lonely path he had. It was a promise he had made to the ghosts of his fallen comrades. You will not be forgotten. Your sacrifice will protect those who come after. He opened his eyes. The gray wall of the holding cell swam back into focus. He thought of Lily, alone in that terrifying courtroom. He had tried to teach her that true strength was quiet, that integrity was a shield. Today, that lesson had come at a terrible price. He had stood his ground not out of pride but out of duty. That box was not his. It belonged to the future. It belonged to the soldiers whose lives it might one day save. Surrendering it to be locked in an evidence locker, to be mishandled by clumsy hands, to be forgotten and eventually destroyed, was not an option. It was an impossibility. He had weighed the consequences. A night in jail, a legal battle. It was a small price to pay for upholding that duty. He just prayed Lily would understand. On the other end of Miller's phone call, the silence broke. A new voice came on the line. It was a man this time, his voice deep, resonant, and carrying an authority that was absolute. It was the kind of voice that did not need to be raised to command armies. "Corporal Miller," the voice said. It was not a question. "You have done the right thing. Your service is appreciated. Now listen to me very carefully. What is the judge's name?" "Thompson, sir. Judge Harrison Thompson," Miller replied, snapping to an unconscious state of attention. "And he has ordered Master Sergeant Thorne held on what grounds?" "Contempt of court, sir, and the assault on an officer." The voice on the other end went dangerously quiet. "Assault," he repeated, the word tasting like poison. "Understood. A federal magistrate is being dispatched to your location. More importantly, I am en route myself. Your new orders are as follows. Return to the courtroom. Stand by the evidence table. You will not allow any person, regardless of rank or station, to touch the Thorn Labyrinth. Use of force, up to and including lethal force, is authorized to protect that asset. Do you understand me, Corporal?" Miller's world tilted on its axis. lethal force to protect a box in a county courtroom. "Sir, yes, sir," he whispered, his mind reeling. "We are 10 minutes out," the voice concluded. "Hold the line." The call ended. 10 minutes. In a nondescript office at Fort Meade, Maryland, General Abram Vance, commander of the Joint Special Operations Command, placed the secure phone back in its cradle. His face, usually a calm, thoughtful mask, was carved from granite. He was a man known as the architect, the strategic genius behind a decade of covert operations. And Elias Thorne, the watchmaker, was his finest instrument, a man who had saved more lives with a pair of wire cutters than entire battalions had with rifles. They had served together for 20 years, from the deserts of the first Gulf War to the mountains of Afghanistan. Elias was more than a subordinate. He was a brother. The thought of him being humiliated, cuffed, and thrown in a cell by some pompous, ignorant local judge sent a wave of cold, controlled fury through him. "Major!" he barked. An aide appeared in the doorway instantly. "Get me my dress uniform, the Class A's, all medals, and assemble the honor guard, 4 of our best. They will accompany me." He pointed to another aide. "Get the Attorney General of the United States on the phone. Inform him that I am about to personally intervene in a state-level judicial matter to prevent a catastrophic breach of national security. Tell him a federal judge has just declared war on my command, and I intend to win." Within minutes, the silent, efficient machinery of the nation's most elite military force was in motion. At Andrews Air Force Base, the flight crew of a sleek black VH-60 White Hawk helicopter scrambled, their movements a blur of practiced urgency. The rotors began to spin, their rhythmic thump-thump-thump, a promise of impending judgment. General Vance, now clad in his immaculate dark blue uniform, his chest a brilliant constellation of medals, the Distinguished Service Cross, the Silver Star, a dozen others that told the story of a lifetime at the sharp end of the spear, boarded the helicopter. With him were 4 command sergeants major, men whose own uniforms were heavy with the history of valor. They were not an escort, they were a message. Back in courtroom 3B, Judge Thompson was savoring his victory. He had disposed of 2 more minor cases with theatrical contempt, his mood buoyed by the adrenaline of his confrontation with Thorne. He was composing the speech he would give at the man's sentencing, a magnum opus on the themes of order, respect, and the folly of defying one's betters. He was a god in his own small heaven, and he was reveling in it. Bailiff Miller had returned to the room, his face pale and set. He walked not to his usual post by the wall, but to the defendant's table. He stood beside the thorn labyrinth, his hand resting on the back of the empty chair. He stood at parade rest, his eyes fixed on the courtroom doors. The other bailiff shot him a questioning look, but Miller ignored him. He was following his last, best order. The first sign of the coming storm was not a sound, but a change in the light. The rhythmic beat of helicopter blades, at first a distant thrum, grew rapidly louder, closer. The sound waves vibrated through the old building, rattling the grimy windows in their frames. The noise was alien here, a sound of war and urgency in a place of slow, grinding bureaucracy. Heads in the gallery turned, murmuring. Judge Thompson scowled, annoyed at the interruption. "What in heaven's name is that racket?" he grumbled. And then the doors burst open. They were not kicked or slammed. They were pushed open with a synchronized, irresistible force that sent them crashing back against the walls. The sound was a thunderclap, a physical blow that shocked the room into absolute silence. Framed in the doorway stood 4 figures, silhouetted against the light of the hallway. They were Titans, clad in uniforms so crisp and dark they seemed to drink the light. The gold on their sleeves and the medals on their chests glittered like angry stars. They moved as one, stepping into the courtroom with a measured, rhythmic tread, their polished black boots striking the marble floor with the inexorable beat of a funeral drum. Leading them was a man who seemed to be the very personification of military authority. General Abram Vance was tall, his posture ramrod straight, his silver hair cropped close to his scalp. His face was a mask of cold, righteous fury, his eyes scanning the room like targeting lasers. The collective gasp of the gallery was a soft, sibilant hiss. The air crackled. This was not the law. This was power. Judge Thompson, his mouth agape, stared at the impossible sight. His mind struggled to process it. Who were these men? What were they doing in his courtroom? He half rose from his chair, his face a comical mixture of confusion and outrage. "What is the meaning of this intrusion?" he sputtered, his voice a pathetic squeak. "This is a court of law. I demand you identify yourselves." General Vance and his men paid him no more heed than they would a fly buzzing against a window pane. Their eyes swept past the judge, past the gallery, past the clerks. They were looking for something, someone. Their gaze locked onto Bailiff Miller, standing guard by the table. Then they saw the box. A collective, almost imperceptible sigh of relief passed between them. The asset was secure. General Vance's eyes then found the door to the holding cells. "Bring him out," Vance commanded, his voice not loud, but imbued with a power that dwarfed the judge's roar. It was a voice that did not brook argument. It simply stated the new reality. One of the sergeants major nodded to Miller. Miller, his heart pounding, unlocked the holding cell door and gestured for Elias to come out. Elias stepped back into the courtroom, his hands still cuffed behind his back. He blinked in the brighter light, his calm expression unchanged. He saw the uniforms, the medals, the grim face of his old commander. He gave a slight, almost imperceptible nod. The four sergeants major marched in perfect formation across the courtroom floor. Their movements were a symphony of precision and discipline. They ignored the sputtering judge, the terrified clerk, the stunned audience. They marched directly to Elias Thorne, the quiet man in the rumpled gray shirt and the handcuffs. They stopped a foot in front of him, and then, in a single fluid motion that was both shocking and profoundly beautiful, General Abram Vance and his three command sergeants major executed the sharpest, most formal, most deeply respectful salute Elias had ever seen. It was a gesture of profound reverence, a public acknowledgment of a debt that could never be repaid. "Master Sergeant Thorne," General Vance said, his voice thick with emotion but steady as a rock. He held the salute, his eyes locked on Elias's. "It is an honor to see you again, sir." The word "sir" hung in the air, a grenade of cognitive dissonance. A four-star general, one of the most powerful men in the entire United States military, calling a handcuffed defendant in a county courtroom, "sir." The room's collective brain seemed to short-circuit. Judge Thompson's face had gone from red to a pasty, sickly white. The blood had drained from it, leaving behind a mask of pure, unadulterated terror. He finally understood. He had not prodded a stray dog. He had kicked a sleeping god. Vance dropped his salute and, with his own hands, produced a key. He stepped behind Elias and personally unlocked the handcuffs. The metallic click echoed the gavel shot from before, but this time it was a sound of liberation, not condemnation. Elias rubbed his wrists, his expression still placid, but his eyes conveyed a deep, weary gratitude. Then General Vance turned. He faced the judge's bench, and the full, unshielded force of his fury was finally unleashed. It was not in his volume, but in his stillness, in the arctic cold of his eyes. "Judge Harrison Thompson," he began, his voice a low, dangerous rumble. The judge flinched, as if struck. "You asked this man who he was, a question you should have asked before you chose to humiliate him. Allow me to answer it for you." He took a step forward, his presence seeming to suck all the air from the room. "This is Master Sergeant Elias Thorne, United States Army, retired. He is the single most decorated explosive ordnance disposal technician in the 100-year history of that specialization. This man, this tinkerer, as you called him, has personally and successfully disarmed over 2,000 improvised explosive devices. He has operated in every theater of war this country has seen for the last 30 years. The scar on his temple is from a secondary detonation in Fallujah that killed the 2 men standing next to him. He stayed and finished the job, saving the rest of the platoon. Vance's voice grew stronger, each word a hammer blow against the judge's crumbling psyche. This man, this nobody, is known in the highest, most classified circles of our military by a single name, the Watchmaker. He is the man we send when no one else can do the job. He is the man who walked into a captured chemical weapons depot in Syria, surrounded by enough nerve agent to kill 1 million people and disabled a dirty bomb with 30 seconds on the clock. He did it alone, with a pair of pliers and a paperclip, because that was all he had. The general pointed a trembling, accusatory finger at the box on the table. "And that," he spat, the word dripping with contempt, "is not a trinket. It is not contraband. That is the Thorn Labyrinth. It is a non-active mechanical training device that Master Sergeant Thorn constructed himself from the disarmed trigger mechanism of a captured tactical nuclear warhead. It is the most complex dissimulation device on the planet. Its purpose is to train the next generation of EOD specialists to deal with the threats of tomorrow. It is a priceless, irreplaceable, and highly classified piece of United States government property. And you, in your breathtaking arrogance, in your petty, pathetic need to feel powerful, ordered it seized. You put your grubby, ignorant hands on a cornerstone of this nation's defense and called it a toy." The silence that followed was absolute. It was the silence of a tomb. Judge Thompson had shrunk in his chair, his robes seeming to swallow him. He looked like a child playing dress-up, his face a mess of sweat and slack-jawed horror. He tried to speak, but only a dry, croaking sound came out. General Vance's aide, a young, stern-faced major, stepped forward. He moved with the predatory grace of a wolf. He placed a thin folder on the clerk's desk. "By the authority of the United States Department of Justice and the National Security Act," the major announced in a clear, ringing voice, "I have here a warrant for the immediate arrest of Harrison Thompson." He looked directly at the judge. "On charges of abuse of power, obstruction of a federal agent in the performance of his duties, unlawful detainment, and willful endangerment of national security assets. A federal grand jury has already been convened." As if on cue, 2 more men entered the courtroom. They were not in military uniform, they wore simple, dark suits, but they moved with the same quiet, dangerous confidence. United States Marshals. They walked past the general, up to the judge's bench. One of them pulled a pair of handcuffs from his belt. "Harrison Thompson, you are under arrest," the lead marshal said, his voice flat and businesslike. "You have the right to remain silent." The indignity was total. The reversal was absolute. The marshals flanked the judge, who was now weeping silently, his body trembling uncontrollably. They did not ask him to step down. One of them reached up and pulled him from his own chair, his throne, as if he were a sack of grain. He stumbled onto the floor of the courtroom, his robes tangling around his feet. The other marshal unceremoniously stripped the black robe from his shoulders, revealing the rumpled, sweat-stained suit beneath. He was no longer a judge. He was just a man, a terrified, broken man, being handcuffed in the center of the room he had ruled like a tyrant moments before. His face, once flushed with power, was now the color of wet ash. A new figure, a severe-looking woman in a judge's robe that was not yet rumpled, stepped forward from the group that had entered with the general. "I am Federal Magistrate Judge Eleanor Vance," she announced. "By order of the Fourth Circuit Court, I am assuming control of this courtroom. The first order of business is to dismiss, with extreme prejudice and with the profound apologies of the United States government, all charges against Master Sergeant Elias Thorn." She looked at Elias, her expression softening. "Sir, you are free to go. Your service and your sacrifice are honored here today." The court was adjourned with a swift, sharp rap of her own gavel. The sound was clean, decisive, and final. As the disgraced Thompson was led away in handcuffs, His head bowed in utter shame, General Vance placed a heavy, comforting hand on Elias's shoulder. "Let's get you home, Sergeant," he said softly. One of the sergeants major carefully picked up the thorn labyrinth, holding it with the reverence it deserved. As they turned to leave, Lily, who had been watching from the back of the courtroom in the care of a court clerk, broke free. "Daddy!" she cried, running across the marble floor. Elias swept her up in his arms, holding her tight against his chest. He buried his face in her hair, inhaling the scent of her shampoo, the scent of home, of everything he fought for. He held his daughter in one arm and, with the other, reached out to take the labyrinth from the sergeant major. He held them both, his two precious responsibilities, with equal, loving care. Surrounded by the giants in their dress uniforms, a phalanx of honor guarding him against the world, Elias Thorne walked out of the courtroom. He did not look back. He did not need to. He had not sought triumph, only justice. He had endured the humiliation, weathered the storm, and held his ground. As he stepped out into the bright, clean sunlight, he glanced for a moment at the disgraced judge being put into the back of an unmarked federal vehicle. There was no victory in Elias's eyes, only a deep, profound sadness. A sadness for a man so blinded by his own small power that he could no longer see the quiet greatness that stood right in front of him. The lesson had been delivered not by his words, but by his unwavering integrity. The fallout from that day in courtroom 3B was swift and seismic. The story of the arrogant judge and the quiet hero became a quiet legend in legal and military circles. Harrison Thompson was convicted on all federal charges. He was stripped of his judgeship, his law license, and his pension. His name was physically chiseled off the cornerstone of the new courthouse wing he had dedicated the year before. He was sentenced to 5 years in a federal penitentiary, where he became just another number, a forgotten man whose hubris had authored his own oblivion. He was the ultimate cautionary tale, a lecture topic in judicial ethics courses for a generation to come. The incident, however, had ripples that went far beyond one man's downfall. Spurred by General Vance's testimony before a congressional committee, a new piece of legislation was fast-tracked into law. It was unofficially known as the Thorne Act. It established new protocols for local and state law enforcement when dealing with retired or active-duty special operations personnel and the sensitive equipment they sometimes carried. It mandated training programs on veteran interaction, focusing on recognizing the signs of discipline and trauma rather than misinterpreting them as defiance or aggression. It created a secure hotline, a direct channel to the Department of Defense for verifying the status of individuals in sensitive situations, ensuring that a mistake like Judge Thompson's could never happen again. Corporal Miller, the young bailiff who had made the fateful call, was summoned to Washington, D.C. In a private ceremony at the Pentagon, General Vance personally awarded him the Superior Civilian Service Award. "You showed judgment and moral courage under pressure, Corporal," Vance had told him, shaking his hand firmly. "You chose to trust a good man when it would have been easier not to. This country needs more men like you." Miller was offered a position with the U.S. Marshal Service, which he accepted without hesitation. His life had been set on a new, more meaningful course. Months bled into a year. Elias Thorne returned to his life. He politely declined offers for television interviews, book deals, and public speaking engagements. He had not sought the spotlight, and he receded from it with his characteristic grace. His small clock repair shop, Thorne and Daughter Timekeepers, continued to operate in quiet obscurity. The bell above the door would jingle, and customers would find a calm, blue-eyed man bent over a workbench, his skilled hands bringing intricate, broken things back to life. He continued his pro bono work on the City Hall clock tower, its deep, resonant chimes now a symbol of his quiet victory. One crisp autumn afternoon, the bell above the shop door jingled. Elias looked up from the delicate escapement wheel of an antique carriage clock. Standing in the doorway was a man he almost didn't recognize. He was thinner, his hair was gray, and the arrogant fire in his eyes had been extinguished, replaced by a hollow, haunted look. It was Harrison Thompson. He was out on parole. He wore a simple, ill-fitting jacket and held a worn cap in his hands, twisting it nervously. "Mr. Thorne," Thompson began, his voice raspy and uncertain. He didn't step further into the shop. I know you don't owe me a moment of your time, but I had to come. I had to say it." He took a shaky breath. "I was wrong. What I did to you, it was monstrous. I was a bully, a fraud, blinded by my own ego. There's no excuse. I wanted to apologize. To you, to your daughter. I am so deeply, truly sorry." The words came out in a torrent, a confession held back for too long. Elias did not stop his work. He carefully picked up a tiny gear with a pair of tweezers and examined it under his magnifying loupe. He listened to the entire apology without interruption. The only sound in the shop was the gentle, rhythmic ticking of a dozen clocks on the walls, a chorus of measured time. When Thompson fell silent, the ticking seemed to grow louder, filling the space left by his words. Finally, Elias set the gear down. He looked up, his pale blue eyes meeting Thompson's. There was no anger in them, no triumph, just a vast, weary calm. "Apologies don't fix what's broken, Mr. Thompson," he said, his voice as quiet as ever. "They don't rewind the clock." He gestured with his tweezers to the complex mechanism on his bench. "This clock stopped working because a spring rusted through. Saying sorry to the clock won't make it tick again. The spring needs to be replaced. The rust needs to be cleaned away. Action is what mends things." Thompson's face fell. He had hoped for absolution, for the lifting of a great weight. He received only a simple, hard truth. "I understand," he mumbled, his eyes on the floor. Elias leaned back in his chair. "What you did to me is in the past. It's what you do now that matters. What you do with the time you have left. That is how you fix what you have broken." He did not offer forgiveness. He did not offer condemnation. He offered a path. A difficult, uncertain path toward redemption, paved not with words but with deeds. It was the only kind of path Elias Thorne knew how to build. Thompson nodded, a single tear tracing a path through the grime on his cheek. He turned and left the shop, the bell jingling his departure. Elias watched him go, then turned back to his workbench. His life remained one of quiet purpose. He was a father, a craftsman, a keeper of time. But his new path had a second, hidden track. Once a month, a black, unmarked car would arrive at his shop before dawn. It would drive him to a secure, windowless facility deep in the Virginia countryside. There, in a sterile, silent room, a group of the nation's brightest and bravest young soldiers would be waiting for him. In the center of the room, on a steel table, would sit the Thorne Labyrinth. And for the rest of the day, Master Sergeant Elias Thorne, the watchmaker, would teach. He would guide their hands, sharpen their minds, and instill in them the calm, unwavering focus that had defined his own life. He would show them how to look into the face of chaos and see only a puzzle to be solved. He remained the underestimated paragon, his true worth measured not in the medals that sat in a box in his closet, nor in the public vindication he had never asked for. It was measured in the steady ticking of the clocks he mended, and in the heartbeats of the future heroes he was quietly teaching how to save the world.